Welcome to Morning Joe on this holiday here in the United States. It is Monday, October 13th. We're still awaiting President Trump's address to the Israeli parliament. You can see there on your screen some of the other speakers. The president is in the room. We see Prime Minister Netanyahu there. A lot happening on a momentous day. Caught up on everything that's happened overnight. Now, all 20 of the remaining living hostages in Gaza have now been released by Hamas. 7 of the hostages were released earlier today, escorted by the Red Cross. Photos of the first 7 hostages showed them looking pale, but not as thin as some of those who were freed back in January. And then, hours later, the final 13 hostages were released. The Israeli military says those were also turned over to the Red Cross in the Gaza Strip. Now, later today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas will attend a summit in Gaza, the Gaza Summit. President Trump also will be there, along with more than 24 world leaders. We're watching now again live, some applause for the Prime Minister of Israel there in the Knesset. We're awaiting President Trump's remarks moments ahead. We'll, of course, bring them to you live. Some real applause there as you can see there on your screen. Let's now bring in some of our best experts to help us sift through this important day. President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, is here. U.S. Special Correspondent for BBC News and the host of the Rest is Politics podcast, Katty Kay. Columnist and Associate Editor for the Washington Post, David Ignatius. And Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University, historian John Meacham. Our thanks to you all. We'll be keeping an eye, of course, on these live events there in Israel. NBC's David Rode also joining us now, happy to say. But Richard Haass, let's start with you. 2 long years to get to this moment, but we should just underscore where we are today, that moment of relief, of joy that so many probably never thought would get here for these families of the final 20 hostages now on their way home.
No, absolutely. It's a political day, but it's also a human day. Tremendous relief, celebration, as you see. There'll be plenty of time later for saying, could we have gotten here sooner? A lot of today is also going to be about where do we go from here. The most interesting news of the day is not just is who's coming to Egypt. And the fact that you're going to have the leader of the Palestinian Authority is a very interesting development because the Israelis have tried to sideline them. But again, this is an important day of accomplishment, but let's be blunt. What remains to be accomplished, Jonathan, is incomparably greater than where we are. But that said, none of that can or should detract from what has been accomplished here. Kudos to President Trump for essentially driving this home. And again, it's the Middle East is not a part of the world we tend to associate with good news. Let's be honest. We tend to measure the history of the Middle East in wars. Today is a rare day of good news.
We're seeing introductions there of speakers, dignitaries in Jerusalem. We also are seeing some live pictures in Tel Aviv, cheering crowds, waving flags. Certainly a moment of real joy there 2 years after the horrors of October 7th, the Hamas terror attack. Now, the final living hostages back in Israeli custody. David Ignatius, can you reset the stage for us, please, in terms of how we got here, these last handful of days, this last week or so, the pressure applied by President Trump? And to Richard's point, there are definitely questions whether this pressure could have been applied earlier, but the pressure that now was brought forth by the White House that got us to this moment where we don't know yet if there's going to be a long-term peace. We don't know yet about the subsequent phases of this deal. But in the short term, there is a ceasefire. The hostages back in Israeli hands.
So President Trump, it's fair to say, got angry and impatient. He'd been talking about peace since he took office in January. And after the Israeli bombing of Qatar, which had been acting as mediator in this conflict, he felt as if the Israelis were closing the avenue for resolving this conflict, and that moved him into a different gear. And he began to gather a group of experts led by his own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who would work with Steve Witkoff, and with other international officials to form the 20-point peace plan, which was the basis for moving towards this initial phase of a ceasefire and hostage exchange. And I think the basic thing to say about what President Trump did is he pushed and pushed. He really wouldn't take no for an answer from the Israelis or any of the leaders gathered. Hamas essentially is being asked to surrender. Hamas, under the terms of this deal, will give up its weapons, its political power. But it's a sign of the exhaustion that they feel and the pressure from Palestinian people themselves who want peace after these 2 terrible years. But we're at this moment today where we see cheering on both sides, cheering in Gaza and cheering in Israel.
We're seeing here live pictures from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, just mentioned by the speaker, which just showed Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and now informal advisor, but playing an instrumental role here in getting this deal done. Caddy K, let's also think about what today means for those in Gaza. The guns are silent. The bombs have stopped falling. There finally is a ceasefire in an enclave where, the future of Hamas's role there is still very much in question. But for so many civilians, and we know there are tens of thousands, estimated 30, 40, 50,000 or more, many of them women or children killed there in the last 2 years, today also brings a sense of some relief.
Yeah, the latest estimates are about 67,000 Gazans have been killed during the past 2 years. And of course, as foreign journalists, we haven't really been into the Strip very much. There have been the odd accompanied visits, but we don't understand totally the scale of what's been happening in Gaza, and maybe we will now get a chance to do that. There are some alarming reports. I was listening to Brett McGurk yesterday on television saying that he had been hearing reports of Hamas reasserting control already in some areas of Gaza, even executing Palestinians as a way of reasserting control in some parts of Gaza. And I think that is just a reminder of how complicated this second phase is going to be. Gosh, the first phase, as all of Joe Biden's team know, was incredibly complicated getting the hostages out. There have been many attempts that have failed to get the hostages out. That has been a very delicate process. They're now home, but this second phase is going to be complicated because the role of Hamas as an organization in any form is obviously under dispute, and it's worrying when you hear they're already trying to reassert themselves in ways that are violent against the Palestinian population. But yes, hopefully this is a good day for Palestinians, and particularly those who have suffered in Gaza as well.
Yeah, so many questions remain as to whether Hamas will indeed demilitarize, will they give up their weapons. There's a lot of skepticism about that. John Meacham, as we await President Trump, we expect his remarks in the next little bit here, and we'll obviously keep watching the proceedings there in Jerusalem. Just your thoughts. It is a historic day. We don't know if it will be the first chapter of a longer story of peace in the Middle East. The president's trying to frame it that way. We simply don't know. But even just for what today means, give us your thoughts, your perspective.
It's a terrific day for the hostage families. It's a terrific day for President Trump, for our national interests. You're right, we don't know how the story ends, but stories are made up of chapters. As Richard Haas knows, he was very much in the arena now 35 years ago, at the end of the first Gulf War, when there was a great conference in Madrid as we tried to reset the peace process. 9 years later, President Clinton, in the last hours of his presidency, made a noble attempt at Camp David. We can go on and on about the various chapters, but we should make no mistake about this. This is a victory for President Trump and for those who wish that we can govern ourselves at home and around the world, not simply by brute force, but by ideas and civilized norms.
President Trump just mentioned there he's receiving a thunderous round of applause in the Knesset in Jerusalem. He's soon to deliver remarks to the parliament. You can see him, the president, now acknowledging the well wishes he's received to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Many U.S. officials and dignitaries in the room. You can hear the chants now for Trump, which he is enjoying as we await his remarks in the moments ahead. David Rohde, obviously, This is a significant day for the president, but let's return to these hostages and their families. You have personal experience as to what it's like to be held captive. What do you think, as best you can imagine, what is it like for those who are now free and those waiting for them with open arms?
Pure, unmitigated joy. Look, they face a tremendous, number of challenges, health-wise, physically, psychologically, but they have survived for 2 years. If you saw the pictures earlier, many who were released, they were very pale, which suggests they were held underground. Some of them weren't as malnourished as other captives who came out, but it's just an amazing day for these hostages and these families, and it's an amazing day for the 2,000 Palestinians that are going to be released and the many, many civilians that Katya was just talking about in terms of on the ground in Gaza. So it's extraordinary. It'll be amazing to see what happens in this speech also. Some of the excerpts that we've already received President Trump is going to say to Israelis, you have achieved everything you could have hoped militarily. Now is the time to try diplomacy. Richard knows more about how that might go, but that sort of sets the stage for the progress, the joy of this day, but the enormous challenges that remain.
Yeah, and Richard, let's talk about that. The president is going to use those words here. I mean, that's what the conclusion that many U.S. officials reached some months ago. That's the conclusion that many Israeli officials reached some months ago, that Israel had achieved all of its military objectives in Gaza. But so talk to us about the situation that Prime Minister Netanyahu is in now. We know that his hold on power had been somewhat tenuous. There's a lot of criminal investigations surrounding him. He will, at some point, you would think, face real blame for what happened on October 7th. Israel had sort of delayed a lot of their intel assessments as to what went wrong because the war was continuing. There had been long-held belief in Washington and other capitals that Netanyahu wanted to prolong the conflict to remain in power. Well, now that's over. So what's next?
Well, it's going to be next to these immediate, these meetings, perhaps some of the first steps of this plan, but then we're going to have Israeli elections. And you're not going to have an accounting on October 7th before Israeli elections because Bibi Netanyahu will still be prime minister. So he's going to run for re-election, my guess is sometime this spring, against the backdrop of having one, defeated Iran, and two, now brought the hostages home. I know some Israelis will not forgive him for the delay. My guess is he stands a pretty good chance. This is not advocacy, this is analysis. I think he's got a pretty good chance of getting the most votes. Then we'll see what's the political nature of the government he forms. Then we begin the new phase, which, if you will, is open-ended, which is the question of what comes next. The real question for President Trump is, do we put on the table something that really begins to flesh out a peace? Because if you read the 20-point plan, the last 2 points deal with political aspirations and trajectory of the Palestinians. They could not be more vague if you tried. Right? They are essentially empty of content. And the question is, does the United States begin to fill out some of that content? And do we begin to push it? And do we basically make the peace, and if we have to, over the heads of a reluctant Israeli government? Do we begin to work with the Palestinians, the Arabs, to build an acceptable partner for Israel? Negotiations don't just happen at the table. All the work to get to the table is going to be up to us. It's going to mean stabilizing Gaza, rebuilding Gaza, coming up with an acceptable Palestinian partner, selling the Israeli public, which in turn will push the Israeli leadership. That's going to be on the United States. That's the history of Middle East peacemaking. The question is this administration prepared to do that work? This would have to become one of the priorities, probably one of the two leading foreign policy priorities for this administration. And the question is, are they prepared to do it?
Do you see signs that they might? Because one of the hallmarks of the President Trump's foreign policy is it's transactional, it's fast, it's quick, he moves on to the next thing. There's often not a lot of follow-through. And to your point, this would require an extraordinary amount of resources, attention, and political capital.
We haven't seen it yet. Let's just be generous. We haven't seen it with Russia and Ukraine. With China policy joined, it's supposed to have a meeting later this month with Xi Jinping. He's talking about a summit next spring. We've had all the tariffs and so forth. We haven't seen that kind of sustained foreign policy push in any context yet. The question is, are they willing, are they able to do it here? But that's what it's going to take. If you think about the history of what President Bush the father did at Madrid, you think about what Jimmy Carter did, what Bill Clinton tried to do, what Jim Baker often did. You are talking about trip after trip after trip, meeting after meeting, phone call after phone call. This, again, has to become a centerpiece of Donald Trump's presidency, of Marco Rubio's era, and so forth. And the question is, are they willing to make that commitment? Because it'll be brutally difficult, given the history of this, Jonathan. You know you're going to have, shall we say, let's be generous again today, an imperfect Palestinian partner and a reluctant Israel. Are we willing and able to push things? Because it's not going to happen without us.